Morning. Good to be here today. Roads weren't too bad this morning, so that's a plus. A little cold, but that's about it. Today is February 21st, right? Okay, then I studied the right one. It's a 12th lesson out of the book. Jacob moves to Egypt. The text is from Genesis 46 and 47. The focus is Genesis chapter 46, 1 through 7, 28 through 30, and chapter 47, 11 through 13, 27, and 28. Key verse is Genesis 47, 27. And Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. The application is the student will conclude that God sees into the future and has already made provisions for his needs. A first look. When we have lived a long time in a stable situation, it is difficult and challenging to change. Jacob was 130 years old when he moved to Egypt, and he and his family had lived for many years in Hebron. Hebron was his home, and even though the famine was bad and sure to get worse, it was a challenge for him to move his family to Egypt. Knowing the history of his family, it may have been that Jacob had especially reluctant to go to Egypt. His grandfather had gotten into trouble in Egypt and had been run out of the country. In Genesis 12, you can see that. His father had attempted to go there once, but God stopped him. These incidents may have been in Jacob's mind as he faced this move. I'm going to go ahead and read that real quick. Genesis 26, verses 1 and 2. And I'm left the wrong chapter there. All right. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. And there was a famine in the land beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went unto Abimelech, king of the Philistines, unto Gerar. And the Lord appeared unto him and said, Go now not down into Egypt, dwell in the land which I shall tell thee of. History was not repeating itself here. In this case, God was leading, and the move to Egypt was the way God provided for his chosen people in this time of difficulty. Any anxiety Jacob may have had about this move was unfounded. Just as God had cared for Joseph, he would care for the rest of the family, no matter what physical location they might occupy. The grace of God is never confined to a geographical region. The God of Canaan was also God in Egypt. God was in Hebron, and he was also in Egypt. Moving to Egypt was God's specific way of providing for his people during this troubling time. Jacob would spend some of the best years of his life in Egypt. He would live there in peace and prosperity for 17 years, whether we find peace or trouble wherever God sends us. The best we can do is follow where he leads and accept what he sends into our lives. Anything to add before we go on? Alright, a closer look. Jacob moves to Egypt. Genesis 46, 1 through 7. And Israel took his journey with all that he had, and came to Beersheba, and offered sacrifices unto the God of his father Isaac. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night, and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here am I. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again. And Joseph shall put his hand upon thine eyes. And Jacob rose up from Beersheba. And the sons of Israel carried Jacob their father and their little ones and their wives in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. And they took their cattle and their goods, which they had gotten in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his seed with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his seed brought him with him, he with him into Egypt. After living for many years in Hebron, Jacob took all he had and began the journey to Egypt. Pharaoh sent wagons to help with the move. In fact, Pharaoh had instructed Jacob to leave everything behind, assuring him that all Jacob needed would be provided once he got to Egypt. However, Jacob did not leave his animals to starve. It was about a week's journey from Hebron to Beersheba. Jacob's grandfather and father had lived in Beersheba, so it was natural to stop here and offer a sacrifice to God. Beersheba was also a kind of gateway city. It was on the border of Canaan and the Sinai Desert. How do you Sinai? Okay, Sinai Desert. Sinai. Okay. No matter what the circumstances, we are wise to get in touch with God before we go into any new activity. God never rebukes us for praying. Like a loving father, he reassures us over and over that we are walking in the right path. Jacob stopped in Beersheba and offered a sacrifice to God. This was his way of worship. That night, God appeared to Jacob in a dream. In his dream, God began by calling Jacob by name. How comforting is it to realize that God knows us by name? To God, we are not a nameless, faceless mass of humanity. We are individuals, each one made in the likeness of our Heavenly Father. God knew what was on Jacob's heart. Jacob was fearful and uncertain about the move he was making. He had little choice, and his mind, Jacob, that he had to go to Egypt. Yet his heart was in Hebron, and he still had doubts. Caution can be a good thing, and there are many situations where we are wise to be cautious, but doubt can also linger in our hearts and settle into a nagging misery. God knew this, so he told Jacob plainly not to be afraid of moving to Egypt. God gave Jacob 3 reassuring promises. First, God promised that he had a plan for Jacob in Egypt. The journey to Egypt was a part of the will of God for this family. God was going to make a great nation out of Jacob and his sons, and the move to Egypt was a part of that process. These people would go to Egypt as a family, but they would come out many years later as a great nation that would enter Canaan once more as a conquering army and take their rightful place among the nations of the world. Then God assured Jacob that he would be with him in Egypt, just as he had been when with him in Haran and in Canaan. God is not limited to a place or time. He can bless us wherever we are. God also assured Jacob that he would return again to the land that he loved. Jacob would be reunited with Joseph, and Egypt would not be his final home, nor would it be the home of his people. With this reassurance, Jacob continued his journey and came into the land of Egypt. The Bible tells us that a total of 70 people made up Jacob's family when he came into Egypt. Years later, over 600,000 men and mixed multitude would return to Canaan. And that is mentioned in Exodus 12:37. I'm going to go ahead and read that just real quick. Exodus 12, verse 37. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men beside children.
Not counting women either.
I mean, that's not counting the women. A lot of people. It's a big growth of a family too. All right, before we go any further, is there anything to add?
Anybody know how long it was in Egypt? Quiz.
I failed.
How long were they in Egypt?
40 years.
About 40 years. 400 years.
400 years, okay, add a zero.
They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years.
Yes, I knew there was a 40 somewhere.
She's not good with no.
They went down to Egypt. And that reference when I was reading the commentary when it says, I will go down, when God told him in verse 4, Genesis 46, I will go with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again, and Joseph shall put his hand upon thine eyes. That reference, that put his hand upon thine eyes, is he was saying, and Joseph, your son, will close your eyes in death. He'll be there when you die.
Okay. Is there anything else to add? All right, I'll go ahead and continue reading. Jacob's family is together again. Genesis 46, verses 28 through 30. And he sent Judah before him unto Joseph to direct his face unto, is that Goshen?
Goshen.
Goshen, okay. And they came into the land of Goshen, and Joseph made ready his chariot, and went up to meet Israel his father in Goshen, and presented himself unto him. And he fell on his neck, and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said unto Joseph, Now let me die, since I have seen thy face, because thou art yet alive. As they approached Egypt, Jacob sent Judah to find Joseph. Joseph directed them to the land of Goshen, which was a fertile plain located in the northeastern part of Egypt. This land was much like the area around Hebron, though more flat. This was a good place to graze the sheep and cattle Jacob had brought with him. As soon as Jacob arrived, Joseph prepared his chariot and rode out to meet his family. He had been reunited with his brothers, but he had not seen his father for many years. Even though Joseph was a ruler in Egypt, he presented himself to his father. He had not lost the proper respect every child should have for his parents. This was a joyous reunion, and the two men, father and son, hugged each other and wept for a long time. It is interesting that great joy often produces the same emotion as great sorrow. We can imagine the joy of Jacob not only at seeing Joseph, but also seeing that Joseph had been very successful. Joseph was a ruler in Egypt for years. Jacob had thought that his beloved son had been killed by a wild animal. He had been told that Joseph was alive, but now he saw it with his own eyes. Jacob expressed his happiness by stating that now he could die in peace because he had at last seen the face of Joseph. Jacob would live for many more years, but he had accomplished one of his longed for but seemingly impossible goals. He had been reunited with his lost son. This happy incident should teach us that for the children of God there is never a final goodbye. We may be separated for a while, but eventually we will be together again, one by one. We make our journey from time into eternity. When we do, we will be with our loved ones who have gone before us forever. What a glad reunion that will be. Joseph understood the ways of the Egyptians, and although Jacob and his sons were primarily shepherds, he told them to emphasize that they kept cattle when they met Pharaoh. The Egyptians did not like sheep or shepherds, and Joseph saw no reason to anger them. Armed with this good advice, Jacob then met Pharaoh. Anything to add before we read the next one?
I was studying a little bit on why did the Egyptians not like shepherds, and I don't know, there's a lot of different thoughts on that they may not have liked them because they were a nomadic people and a distrust of nomadic people that came and went. It was interesting that they didn't like shepherds and sheep.
Sheep eat grass all the way down to the ground.
Yeah.
And cows can't come in behind them, sheep can eat. So, they compete for land, and the sheep get there first, and cows don't have nothing to eat. So they don't share together.
Okay. I didn't look it up. I'm sorry.
They didn't like them in the westerns.
No.
The cattle people did not like the sheep.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, when we lived out Liberty, we had goats and stuff. They would do the same. They clear, make it nothing but mud. And the cows, they just eat the top of the grass. So I could understand it. All right. We'll go ahead and continue. Israel prospers in Egypt. Genesis 47, verses 11 through 13, 27, and 28. And Joseph placed his father and his brethren, and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of, how do you say that again?
Goshen? Or
The Ramesses?
Ramses. Yeah.
Ramses.
Ramses.
All right. In the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph nourished his father and his brethren, and all his father's household, with bread, according to their families. And there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore, so that the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan fainted by reason of the famine. And Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the whole age of Jacob was 147 years. In these verses, we see how Joseph cared for his family, and also Joseph's wisdom in using this time of famine to Pharaoh's advantage. Joseph advised his brothers to say that they dwelt with cattle, not sheep, because shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians. However, when 5 of the brothers appeared before Pharaoh, they plainly told Pharaoh that they were shepherds. Joseph did not rebuke or punish them. His love for Joseph was greater than his prejudice, and he told Joseph to put his family in the very best part of the land. Joseph responded by settling his family near Ramses, the storehouse city that was located in the land of Goshen. God was looking way ahead when this happened. Hundreds of years later, when Israel left Egypt, they stripped this storehouse city bare and had provisions for a part of their long journey into Canaan. This is a lesson in the great overriding plans of God and his providence for us in all things. Joseph provided abundantly for his family during the famine. He saw to it, and his family did not suffer or lack for anything. This is a picture of the grace of God, providing abundance even for those who once may have been enemies of the cross and persecutors of God's people. Joseph also used his administrative talents to enrich Egypt. During this famine, things got worse before they got better. At the low point in the famine, money became worthless in Egypt, and many Egyptian farmers were willing to trade their lands for food. Joseph made many such trades. He allowed the farmers to stay on the land and sow it, but now 1/5 or 20% of the crops would go to Pharaoh. In this way, the farmers were saved from the famine, and Pharaoh was made wealthy after the famine was over. Only the land that belonged to the priest was exempt from this tax. Jacob lived out his years in peace and harmony in Egypt, and died when he was 147 years old. Anything to add before we go into a final word? All right, we'll go ahead and continue. Final word. This 7-year-long famine was a worldwide disaster. We should notice that God used this time of trial for the benefit of his people. The famine was not a problem for Joseph or for Jacob and his other sons. Those who knew and followed God were able to weather the storm and even prosper in it. The famine gave Joseph an opportunity to resurrect the economy system. What is it?
Restructure.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Opportunity to restructure the economic system of Egypt and made the government powerful and wealthy for years to come. Hard times often destroy many people. Many nations all around Egypt were focused to come to Joseph in Egypt to buy corn so that they could survive. No doubt many people perished in the famine. Through all this trouble, God preserved his people and anyone else who would listen to the words of God that were revealed to Joseph. Joseph accurately interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh. For 7 years, the Egyptians stored up grain, when it must have appeared that the good harvest would go on indefinitely. It requires a great deal of wisdom to take an honest look at the future and prepare adequately for the hard times that are surely ahead. This is exactly what Jesus urged us to do when he taught that we are to lay up our treasures in heaven, where it is eternally secure. Lay up treasures in the storehouse of heaven, and they will never fade away. All that is on earth will be lost one way or another, but what we do for God will last throughout eternity. Okay. Anything to add?
There's a lot of similarities with Joseph and Christ. You know, he's a type of Christ. If you look at it, he was sold into slavery, sold into Egypt. How many pieces of silver was he sold for?
30.
How many pieces was Jesus sold for?
30.
Not saying what.
Joseph 20?
It's very similar.
Yeah, very, very similar.
I
He's,
thought it was
but he was sold into slavery. He ended up saving his people. Jesus, saved. He's our salvation. Joseph took a Gentile bride in Egypt, and Jesus has a Gentile bride in the church. So there's a lot of neat things to look at there. He's a type of Christ.
All right. Anything else to add? I apologize with those words. I usually try to focus on the words a good bit for at least a good day while I'm studying because I struggle with them. But this week was a little busy for us. But that's it. We'll go ahead and dismiss and meet back here in about 15 minutes.